December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades. Snow fell in heavy silence over frozen roads and shattered trees. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Weapons jammed. Engines refused to start. Men on both sides of the front line fought not only the enemy, but the cold itself. In these forests, Germany launched what would become its final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler believed a sudden winter strike through the Ardennes could split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. German troops moved forward through the snow with orders to advance fast and live off captured Allied supplies. But there was a problem. By late 1944, the German war machine was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Years of total war had drained the Reich's economy. Allied bombing had crippled factories and rail networks. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was rationed, and food, even for frontline soldiers, was becoming dangerously limited. Many German soldiers entering the Ardennes offensive were already underfed. Official daily rations were often cut in half before they even reached the front. Bread arrived stale or frozen. Meat was rare. Sometimes a soldier's meal consisted of little more than thin soup and a small piece of dark bread. Coffee had long since been replaced with bitter substitutes made from roasted barley or acorns. Meanwhile, across the lines, American forces were fighting a very different war. For the United States, World War II had become a demonstration of industrial power on a scale the world had never seen before. American factories produced weapons, vehicles, clothing, and food in staggering quantities. Cargo ships crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys, carrying not only tanks and ammunition, but millions upon millions of carefully designed combat rations. Each American soldier carried food in his pocket, compact, calorie-dense packages designed by scientists and produced by massive food companies. To the men who ate them every day, they were ordinary, sometimes even boring. But to a starving enemy soldier in the frozen woods of the Ardennes, a young German grenadier moved cautiously through the trees. The snow reached above his boots. His uniform was stiff with ice. His stomach had been empty for far too long. His unit had advanced quickly at first, but supply trucks never arrived. Fuel shortages delayed transport. Roads were clogged with vehicles. Allied air attacks had destroyed bridges and rail lines. As the days passed, hunger spread through the ranks. The soldiers searched abandoned American positions, hoping to find something useful. Ammunition, perhaps, a blanket, maybe even food. Then he saw it. Half buried in the snow sat a small cardboard box. It looked ordinary, light brown, with English writing stamped across the side, the kind of thing American soldiers carried everywhere. Inside was something the German soldier had not seen in a very long time. A tin of processed cheese, a packet of instant coffee, sugar-coated chewing gum, crackers sealed in wax paper, even a small roll of toilet paper. This was not a luxury item. It was not an officer's meal or a rare supply crate. This was just one American ration. The U.S. military had spent years designing these packages. Nutrition scientists, including physiologist Ancel Keys, studied how many calories a soldier needed to fight, march, and survive under combat conditions. The result was the famous K-Ration, a compact meal meant to provide roughly 2,800 to 3,000 calories per day when combined with multiple boxes. Each ration was carefully balanced: carbohydrates for quick energy, protein for strength, sugar for morale, coffee to keep soldiers alert. Even small comforts like chewing gum and cigarettes were included to keep morale high in the worst conditions. To American troops, these rations were routine. Soldiers often complained about eating the same crackers and cheese day after day. Some joked that the chocolate bars were so hard they could break a tooth. Others traded items they didn't like. But to a hungry German soldier in the frozen woods of the Ardennes, this small box revealed something terrifying. It meant the enemy could afford to feed every soldier like this, every day. Germany could not. By late 1944, German supply lines were collapsing under constant Allied bombing and fuel shortages. Trucks sat idle without gasoline. Railroads were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Even when food existed, getting it to the front was becoming impossible. American logistics operated on an entirely different scale. Massive supply depots organized by the U.S. Quartermaster Corps pushed food, ammunition, and equipment across oceans and continents. Ships arrived daily in European ports loaded with supplies. Trucks carried them to depots. From there, endless convoys delivered them directly to the front. By the end of the war, the United States would transport more than 70 billion pounds of food to feed its forces around the world. For the German soldier holding that ration box, the message was clear without anyone saying a word. This was not just a battle between armies, it was a battle between economies, between scarcity and abundance, between a nation running out of resources and one whose factories seemed capable of producing almost anything in unlimited quantities. Historians often focus on tanks, artillery, and strategy when discussing the Battle of the Bulge, but in the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, another truth quietly revealed itself. Wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by the ability to supply millions of soldiers with everything they need: bullets, boots, fuel, and something as simple as a warm meal. And sometimes, the contents of a single soldier's pocket could reveal the outcome of the entire war. In the early years of the Second World War, military planners across the world faced a problem that had nothing to do with tanks or artillery. It was a problem much simpler and yet far more complicated at the same time. How do you feed a soldier who is constantly moving? Traditional military food had always relied on large kitchens and supply wagons. Armies marched, stopped, and then cooked. But modern warfare had changed everything. Soldiers now traveled by truck, parachute, landing craft, and aircraft. Battles could unfold quickly and unpredictably. Troops might be cut off from supply lines for days. In these conditions, a soldier needed something different from a traditional meal. He needed food that could fit in his pocket, survive harsh weather, and still provide enough energy to fight. By 1941, the United States Army realized it needed a completely new kind of combat ration. The problem was given to a man who did not look like a military officer or a weapons designer. His name was Ancel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota who specialized in human nutrition. Keys was asked a very direct question by the U.S. War Department. If a soldier had to survive for several days while moving quickly, carrying everything on his body, what kind of food would keep him alive and effective? Keys began thinking about the problem scientifically. A soldier marching for hours through rough terrain burned enormous amounts of energy. In cold weather, the body needed even more calories just to maintain its temperature. Food had to be lightweight, compact, and high in energy. But there were also practical limits. A soldier already carried weapons, ammunition, medical gear, and other equipment. Any ration had to fit into a small space. It had to survive heat, cold, rain, and rough handling. It had to last for months without spoiling. And most importantly, it had to be ready to eat instantly. No cooking required. Keys and his team began testing combinations of foods that could meet these requirements. They experimented with biscuits, canned meat, chocolate, powdered drinks, and concentrated sugars. The goal was to pack as many calories as possible into the smallest possible package. Eventually, they created a simple system: 3 small cardboard boxes: breakfast, dinner, supper.
Together, these three boxes formed what would become known as the K-Ration. The letter K was widely believed to stand for keys, though the Army never officially confirmed it. Each box contained a carefully selected group of foods. There were crackers, processed cheese or canned meat, a chocolate or energy bar, chewing gum, cigarettes, and a powdered drink mix. Small accessories like matches and toilet paper were included as well. The design was practical, almost minimalist. Each item had a purpose. Crackers provided carbohydrates for quick energy. Meat and cheese supplied protein and fat. Chocolate offered both calories and a morale boost. Sugar tablets could provide an immediate burst of energy when a soldier was exhausted. Even chewing gum played a role. Soldiers in combat often could not brush their teeth, so gum helped keep their mouths moist and clean. The drink powders were also carefully chosen. Lemon powder or instant coffee could be mixed with water from a soldier's canteen, turning plain water into something more refreshing. Altogether, the daily set of K-rations delivered roughly 2,800 to 3,000 calories, enough to sustain a soldier in active combat for several days. At least, that was the theory. The K-ration was never meant to be a permanent diet. It was designed for short, intense operations when traditional field kitchens could not follow troops into battle. Paratroopers, reconnaissance units, and fast-moving infantry were the primary users, and soon those soldiers would face some of the most important operations of the war. In July 1943, Allied forces launched the invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky. Thousands of American paratroopers jumped from aircraft into enemy territory at night, landing miles behind German and Italian lines. These soldiers could not carry heavy equipment. Every pound mattered. The K-ration became their lifeline. Paratroopers landed in the dark with weapons, ammunition, and a few small boxes of food in their pockets. Those rations had to last until the invasion forces linked up with them. A year later, the same system would support one of the most famous operations in military history. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched D-Day. Before dawn, thousands of American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped into Normandy. Once again, their pockets carried the same small cardboard boxes, K-rations. For soldiers scattered across the French countryside, sometimes isolated for days, those rations became essential. They could be eaten quickly, quietly, and without preparation. Yet despite their careful design, the K-ration was far from perfect. Many soldiers quickly grew tired of the same limited menu. Crackers and cheese every day could become monotonous. The meat tins were sometimes greasy. The chocolate bars were dense and hard. Some soldiers began trading items among themselves. Others discarded things they disliked. But even with these complaints, the ration served its purpose. It kept soldiers alive, moving, and capable of fighting under conditions where no other food could reach them. Meanwhile, the ability of the United States to produce millions of these rations revealed something larger about the war itself. Every K-ration box represented an entire industrial system working behind the scenes. Farmers grew the wheat and sugar. Factories processed the food. Packaging plants sealed the boxes. Railroads and cargo ships transported them across oceans. The ration in a soldier's pocket was only the final step of a massive logistical chain, and that chain stretched all the way back to American farms and factories thousands of miles away. For the soldiers who carried them through Sicily, Normandy, and eventually into Germany, the K-ration became a symbol of something powerful. It was proof that no matter how far they traveled, the resources of an entire nation were following behind them. In modern warfare, strength was no longer measured only by the size of an army. It was measured by the ability to keep that army fed.
In 1937, several years before the United States officially entered the Second World War, the U.S. Army approached a company that most Americans already knew very well. The company was the Hershey Company, famous for producing millions of chocolate bars each year. But the Army was not interested in making a sweeter chocolate bar. Instead, they had a strange request. Military officials wanted a chocolate ration that could serve as an emergency survival food for soldiers in combat. It needed to meet several very specific requirements. The bar had to weigh exactly 4 ounces. It needed to deliver a high number of calories. It had to withstand extreme heat without melting. And perhaps most surprising of all, it should not taste too good. The Army explained their reasoning very clearly. If the chocolate tasted like normal candy, soldiers would eat it too quickly. This ration was meant to be saved for emergencies when no other food was available. It needed to be edible, but not tempting. In fact, one of the official requirements stated that the chocolate should taste only slightly better than a boiled potato. For most candy makers, that would sound like a terrible idea. But for the chemists and engineers at Hershey, it became a fascinating challenge. A man named Sam Hinkle, Hershey's chief chemist at the time, began experimenting with new formulas. Traditional chocolate bars contained cocoa butter, which melted easily in warm temperatures. That would not work for soldiers carrying the bar in tropical heat or inside a uniform pocket. So Hinkle created a new mixture using chocolate liquor, sugar, skim milk powder, cocoa fat, oat flour, and artificial flavoring. The ingredients were compressed into a dense, extremely hard bar that resisted melting even in high temperatures. The result was something very different from ordinary chocolate. The bar was tough. Soldiers often joked that it felt like a brick. Breaking off a piece required effort, and chewing it could take several minutes. But it delivered exactly what the Army wanted. Around 600 calories packed into a small, durable block of food. This product became known as the D ration. The D stood for defense, though soldiers would later invent their own interpretations of the name. During the early years of the war, Hershey began producing these rations in massive quantities. The company adapted its factory lines to handle the new formula, which was much thicker and harder to process than normal chocolate. At peak production, Hershey factories produced more than 24 million D-ration bars every week. They were shipped across the world to American troops in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. For soldiers, the D-ration was never meant to replace normal meals. It was an emergency ration, something to be carried in case a unit became isolated, lost, or cut off from supply lines. But the bar quickly developed a reputation among the troops. Because of its hardness and slightly bitter flavor, many soldiers disliked eating it. Some tried shaving pieces off with knives. Others dissolved small chunks in hot water to create a thick chocolate drink. In the ranks, soldiers began jokingly calling it Hitler's secret weapon, suggesting that the bar was almost as difficult to defeat as the enemy. Yet, despite the jokes, the D-ration performed exactly as intended. In tropical environments, such as the Pacific Islands, ordinary chocolate would have melted into a sticky mess. The D-ration remained solid even in intense heat. Soldiers could carry it in their packs for months without spoilage. And when food supplies ran low, those dense bars could mean the difference between exhaustion and survival. As the war continued, the Army realized that some improvements were needed. Troops operating in extremely hot climates, especially in the Pacific theater, still experienced problems with the bars softening slightly. So, Hershey developed a new version called the tropical bar. This updated ration was even more heat-resistant and slightly improved in taste, though it remained far from a luxury treat. By the end of the war, Hershey had produced more than 3 billion ration bars for the U.S. military. The scale of production was so impressive that the company received the Army Navy E Award for excellence in wartime manufacturing,
an honor given to factories that made extraordinary contributions to the war effort. For the soldiers who carried them, the chocolate bars became a strange symbol of wartime practicality. They were not meant to be enjoyed, they were meant to work. Each bar represented the mindset of an entire wartime industry, a system focused on efficiency, durability, and survival under extreme conditions. In a sense, the D-ration reflected the broader philosophy behind American wartime logistics. Everything had a purpose. Everything was engineered for reliability. And even something as simple as a chocolate bar could be redesigned, mass-produced, and delivered across the globe to support soldiers fighting thousands of miles from home. While German soldiers often struggled with shrinking rations and supply shortages, American troops carried emergency calories in their pockets, a product of factories operating at a scale the world had never seen before. The D-ration may not have been delicious, but it was dependable. And in war, dependability can be just as powerful as any weapon.
In war, soldiers quickly learned that survival often depends on the smallest tools. A rifle may win a firefight, but the simple objects carried in a pocket can determine how comfortably, or even whether, a soldier makes it through the day. Among American troops during the Second World War, one of the most valued items was not a weapon at all. It was a tiny piece of stamped metal, no longer than a man's finger. It weighed less than an ounce, and yet soldiers carried it everywhere. The tool was known as the P-38 can opener. At first glance, it looked almost insignificant, a thin strip of metal folded around a small hinged cutting blade. There were no moving parts beyond the hinge, no springs, no complex mechanism. It could easily be mistaken for a scrap of metal. But for millions of American soldiers, this tiny device became one of the most important pieces of equipment they owned. To understand why, it helps to remember what wartime food looked like. A large portion of American military rations came in metal cans. These contained meat, cheese spreads, fruit, and other preserved foods designed to survive months of transport across oceans and rough battlefields. Canned food was durable, safe, and long-lasting. There was only one problem. Opening those cans without the right tool could be extremely difficult. Before the P-38, soldiers often had to improvise. Some used bayonets or knives to puncture the lid. Others smashed cans against rocks or used rifle butts to break them open. These methods were slow, dangerous, and sometimes ruined the food inside. The U.S. military needed something simple, lightweight, and reliable that every soldier could carry. The solution came from the engineers of the U.S. Quartermaster Corps. Around 1942, they developed a tiny folding can opener that could be attached to a key ring or worn on a dog tag chain. It required no instructions and almost never broke. To use it, a soldier would unfold the small blade, hook the metal edge of the opener onto the rim of a can, and begin puncturing the lid with short downward movements. With each motion, the blade cut a small section of the metal until the entire lid could be removed. It was simple, efficient, and surprisingly fast. The official name given to the tool was the P-38. There are several stories explaining where the name came from. One popular legend among soldiers claimed that it took exactly 38 punctures to open a standard military ration can. Another explanation suggests the number referred to the model designation assigned by the military during development. Whatever the true origin, the name stuck. Soldiers quickly developed a deep appreciation for the little opener. Unlike larger kitchen tools, the P-38 could be carried anywhere without noticeable weight. It could open a can in less than a minute, and because it was made from a single piece of hardened steel, it was extremely durable. If a soldier lost his rifle cleaning kit, it could be replaced. If boots wore out, new ones could eventually arrive.
but losing a P-38 could be surprisingly frustrating. Some soldiers kept theirs attached to their dog tags, so it was always close at hand. Others tied them to keychains or stitched them into uniform pockets. Many troops carried the same opener throughout the entire war. Over time, the P-38 earned a nickname among American troops. They called it John Wayne. The reason was simple. Like the famous Hollywood actor known for playing tough, reliable characters in Western films, the P-38 was small, tough, and always dependable. The tool soon gained a reputation for versatility far beyond opening cans. Soldiers discovered that it could be used as a screwdriver, a small pry bar, or even a makeshift scraper for cleaning rifles. Some used it to tighten loose screws on equipment. Others used the sharp edge to cut tape or packaging. In the hands of a creative soldier, the tiny piece of metal became a multi-purpose survival tool. Millions of them were produced during the war, and they were included with countless American ration packs. They required almost no manufacturing resources, just a small amount of steel and a simple stamping process. Yet their usefulness was enormous. The P-38 perfectly represented the philosophy behind American wartime logistics. Simple tools, mass-produced, distributed everywhere, and designed to make a soldier's life easier in small but important ways. For troops in muddy trenches, frozen forests, and tropical jungles, those small improvements mattered. A soldier who could quickly open a can of food without damaging the contents could eat faster, recover energy, and return to his duties. A soldier who carried reliable tools could solve problems without waiting for help. In the chaos of war, these small advantages added up. While massive tanks and aircraft captured headlines, it was often the quiet efficiency of small tools like the P-38 that made everyday military life manageable. Even decades after the war ended, many veterans kept their P-38 openers as souvenirs. The tiny tool became a symbol of wartime ingenuity, a reminder that sometimes the simplest inventions prove to be the most valuable. A piece of metal small enough to disappear in a pocket had quietly become one of the most trusted companions of the American soldier.
By the final years of the Second World War, it had become increasingly clear that modern war was not decided only on the battlefield. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery were powerful weapons, but they were only part of a much larger system. Behind every soldier at the front stood an enormous network of farms, factories, railways, ports, and ships working without pause. Victory depended on something far less dramatic than combat. It depended on logistics. For the United States, the war quickly turned into a demonstration of industrial capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen. Long before American soldiers reached the beaches of Europe or the islands of the Pacific, American factories were already operating day and night to supply them. Weapons rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Trucks, tanks, aircraft, uniforms, boots, medical kits, and radio equipment were produced in staggering numbers. But among the most essential supplies of all was something much simpler: food. An army marches on its stomach, as the famous saying goes, and in a global war involving millions of soldiers, feeding those armies became one of the greatest logistical challenges in history. The responsibility for this enormous task fell largely on the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. The Quartermaster Corps had existed long before the war, but World War II forced it to expand to a scale few could have imagined. Its mission was simple in theory: make sure every American soldier, no matter where he was fighting, received the supplies necessary to survive and fight. In practice, that meant organizing one of the largest supply operations ever attempted. American farms produced vast quantities of wheat, corn, sugar, meat, and dairy products.
These raw ingredients were transported to food processing plants across the country. There, companies packaged them into canned goods, powdered drinks, ration bars, crackers, cheese spreads, and countless other forms suitable for long-distance transport. Factories sealed millions of ration boxes every week. Once packaged, the food began an extraordinary journey. Railroads carried the supplies across the United States to coastal ports. At those ports, the cargo was loaded onto massive convoys of ships bound for Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Crossing the ocean was dangerous. German submarines hunted Allied shipping in the Atlantic, and Japanese naval forces threatened supply lines in the Pacific. Yet the convoys kept moving. Escort ships protected the cargo vessels, while naval patrol aircraft scanned the waters for enemy submarines. Despite losses at sea, the overall flow of supplies never stopped. When the ships reached Allied-controlled ports overseas, the food was unloaded and sent to huge supply depots built near the front lines. From there, fleets of trucks carried the rations to field kitchens and frontline units. It was a constant flow of movement, from farms to factories, factories to railroads, railroads to ships, ships to ports, ports to trucks, and trucks to soldiers. By the end of the war, the scale of this system was almost impossible to comprehend. The United States transported more than 70 billion pounds of food to support its forces and its allies around the world. That number included everything from canned meat and powdered eggs to flour, coffee, chocolate, and emergency rations. The impact of this logistical power was felt everywhere American soldiers fought. In Europe, Allied troops advancing across France often found themselves eating regular hot meals only a short distance behind the front lines. Mobile field kitchens followed the armies as they moved forward. When conditions made cooking impossible, soldiers still carried rations in their pockets. In the Pacific, where battles were fought across remote islands thousands of miles from major cities, the supply chain was even more impressive. Cargo ships and transport aircraft delivered food to isolated bases surrounded by ocean and jungle. Even under those extreme conditions, American soldiers rarely faced the severe hunger that plagued many other armies. For Germany, the situation was dramatically different by the later stages of the war. Allied bombing campaigns targeted factories, railroads, and fuel depots across the country. Transportation networks were constantly disrupted. Fuel shortages made truck transport unreliable. As resources dwindled, feeding frontline troops became increasingly difficult. By 1944, German soldiers were often fighting while receiving reduced rations. Supplies arrived late, incomplete, or sometimes not at all. The difference between the two systems became painfully clear during campaigns like the Battle of the Bulge. While German forces struggled with fuel shortages and failing supply lines, American logistics continued pushing food, ammunition, and equipment toward the front. Behind each American soldier stood a vast industrial nation capable of sustaining war on a global scale. This is why the United States was often called the arsenal of democracy. It was not simply producing weapons, it was producing everything required to sustain millions of soldiers across two enormous theaters of war. Rations like the K-Ration and the D-Ration were only the most visible pieces of this system. Behind them stood farmers harvesting crops, factory workers packaging food, engineers designing containers, sailors crossing dangerous oceans, and truck drivers navigating muddy roads near the front. Each step in the chain mattered, because in modern war, victory does not belong only to the army that fights the hardest. It belongs to the nation that can keep its armies supplied the longest. And sometimes the story of that victory can be found not in the barrel of a gun or the armor of a tank, but in something much smaller: a tin of cheese, a packet of coffee, a piece of chocolate. and the quiet certainty that tomorrow another ration will arrive.